So let's talk about the science surrounding abortion. One of the things that drives me absolutely up a wall is we've now been through probably 15 or 20 minutes of this interview. You've not mentioned your religious stance once. And yet when you talk with people who are pro-choice, or when you read the columns written by people who are pro-choice, their fundamental assumption, their baseline assumption seems to be that if you're pro-life, the reason that you're pro-life is because you're religious. So this really leads to two questions. One, why is that assumption made? And two, why is it that there is such heavy crossover between people who are pro-life and people who are religious, when the science, again, should tend toward making people pro-life? Why aren't there more secular pro-lifers, in other words?
Right. I think it's because of actual, literal science denial that's happening on the left largely, even among those who say that we're pro-science, look at climate change, look at all these things. They won't actually look and acknowledge the biological realities of what's happening with life in the womb. I mean, we deal with this all the time. We're educating young people. I was just talking with a young girl just in the last few days who was saying, I'm an atheist, so I'm pro-choice. And I said, well, let's talk about that. When does life begin? And she said, well, I think it's just an egg early on in the first trimester. I said, well, that's actually scientifically incorrect. An egg, a sperm fertilizes an egg, then you have a single cell embryo, and that's a unique individual human life. That's what the science shows. And it was like mind-blowing for this young girl. And I said, where are you getting your information? And she said, oh, I'm just getting it from, a friend that is more liberal or something like that. And I said, if you actually pick up any human biology textbook, it will tell you when life begins. It begins at the moment of fertilization, when that egg completely is transformed because of the sperm and becomes a complete DNA code for an individual human life. And all that life needs is time and nourishment to grow. So I think it's really just this crazy environment that we're in today, where this basic science about the origin of human life is being hidden from people, or because of our obsession with keeping abortion legal and defending it to the death, we are refusing to acknowledge basic scientific realities about human life. And to your second question about people who are religious who tend to be a lot more pro-life, I mean, I think that's because when you start to have any kind of a moral view of the universe, and everybody is religious in some way, even an atheist, their religion is, I believe there's no God, absolutely, right? Or agnostic, their religion is, I don't know, and so I'm going to live my life this certain way. Everybody has a worldview. We'll call it religion, call it worldview. It's the way they live their lives. It's the code by which they live. And what is the code by which we will live in our society? If people of most major faiths today are pro-life because they've acknowledged human life has to be precious. Human life has to be valuable. If we don't see the value of every single human life, then all of a sudden we enter into all kinds of injustices and justifications for abuses against human dignity. And that's where human rights abuses, how they happen, because we start to dehumanize one group of the population, whether because of their sex or because of their race or because of their political background or their faith or their size, their level of development, because they're so small, they're in the womb. So I think it makes sense if you're religious to be pro-life. If you're not religious or your worldview is whatever you want it to be, if you think that human beings have human rights, you should be pro-life, period.
One of the things that you mentioned when you talk about science denial, and that is completely obvious, is how the left wishes to deny the ability of people to even see ultrasound photos. It's absolutely astonishing. I mean, my listeners know my wife is now 6 months, a little bit over 6 months pregnant, and she's due at the beginning of March. You're obviously pregnant. The quality of the ultrasounds now is so unbelievably high. When we had the first ultrasound of the newest kid at, I think, 8 or 9 weeks, the quality of the ultrasound is so unbelievable. I mean, it doesn't look like static, like your parents' ultrasound. It looks like a full child. I mean, it looks like a child. And while that's not a great argument for what constitutes a human life, because the look of something doesn't necessarily mean what it is, it is so perfectly obvious on its face what exactly you are looking at that it's no wonder that groups like Planned Parenthood wish to forcibly discourage people from taking a look at ultrasounds.
And it's even like when you look at miscarriage. I mean, Planned Parenthood's now ex-president, Dr. Leanna Wen, she wrote publicly about a miscarriage that she had. And this was right before she was fired by Planned Parenthood. So this happened over the summer. It was this big hullabaloo. And she's the first doctor in dozens of years that Planned Parenthood allowed to be their head. And then she wasn't pro-abortion enough for them. But she wrote this article talking about the grief she felt after her miscarriage. That same baby, that same age, can be killed legally at Planned Parenthood clinics across the country. And why is the child, you have a baby shower, you're pregnant with a baby, you're expecting a baby. Why all of a sudden it's completely illogical? Is it no longer a baby, no longer a life, no longer someone to be grieved just because you don't confer value on it as the parent or the person making the decision? It's not logical. And I think the more people learn about facts about life in the womb, what abortion is, they realize it's not logical. And so to be logical, to be pro-science, to be reasonable, this is a life that deserves protection like you or like I do.
So why do you think it is that the left has moved away from what seemed to be a lot safer political ground even 25 years ago, the safe, legal, and rare formulation, the idea that, sure, this is uncomfortable, sure, we're not saying that it's totally morally fine, but at the same time, there are certain people who are in need, and we wouldn't want to make it illegal, and we want to make it safe for them to get an abortion. Why do you think the left has forcibly disabused themselves of this notion? I mean, now you're seeing the full-on celebrate abortion, shout your abortion, light up towers in New York pink, if you're going to legalize abortion up till point of birth. Why do you think the left has made that radical shift? Because it is a politically bewildering shift. One of those formulations is a lot more popular than the other.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And all the Democratic candidates right now, unfortunately, are all pro-abortion. I mean, pretty much through all 9 months. Tulsi Gabbard is like, maybe in the third trimester, there's some babies that we should protect.
And then they yell at her.
And then they yell at her, exactly. I think there's two things. First of all, the abortion lobby is extremely powerful. Planned Parenthood has been receiving over $500 million in taxpayer money for years and years and years. So they've been receiving multi-billions from the federal government and from state governments. And their political power is huge. They invested $30 million to try to defeat Trump last round. They're going to invest another $50 million this coming round. So the abortion lobby is a real thing, and they have a lot of power with these politicians, and they are only content with abortion through all 9 months for any reason. There's no moderation when it comes to the abortion industry. I mean, of course not. They want to kill, and they want license to kill at any age for any reason. So there's that. I think the second thing, though, is they're actually being logically consistent now, Ben. I mean, before they weren't, right? And I think they're kind of realizing, wow, if we compromise, it's not too long until we might find ourselves out of a job as being pro-abortion or, supporting the abortion industry. Because once you say you can protect some lives, then the argument to why don't we just protect them all if they're human lives to begin with is a very strong one. So I think now they're actually being logically consistent by saying, nope, if they're in the womb, doesn't matter how old, doesn't matter for what reason, you should have license to kill.
So let's talk for a second about the effective approaches on the pro-life side versus the ineffective approaches on the pro-life side. So you've spent an awful lot of time, an awful lot of money trying to reach out to people with pro-life messages. So you probably have some good information about what is effective and what is ineffective. Why don't we start with the ineffective? What's been the least effective approach that you think people use when it comes to moving people toward a pro-life position?
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of diversity. So I would say there are some really, not silver bullets, but there are some really strong arguments and approaches that work for a lot of people. But some people, it's interesting that even some of the lesser effective approaches in the pro-life movement still make a difference for some people. So I would never say, stop doing what you're doing out there. Anybody doing anything for life, lovingly, with compassion, I think is good. Whether it's very effective in my book or not, I mean, I'll choose my own strategies. So I know it's kind of like going around your question, but I would say anything that's angry or cruel, I don't think is effective because you're dealing with people and a lot of wounded people. I mean, there are so many people who have been hurt by abortion. Women, men, abortions in their history, and they still are not even sure how to wrestle with it. They're not healed from it. Part of that is they haven't been able to acknowledge it was a life. It was their child that was killed. And so there's a lot of woundedness. So anytime that we get on our high horse, if we act with a judgmentalism or we're cruel or unkind in our approach, I think that can be very harmful and ineffective.